Gottinya. Hello everyone and welcome to Lockdown. My name is Emma Allsopp and today we are joined by the esteemed journalist and UTV's former political editor, Ken Reid. We are also joined by Alana Cahoon and Lauren Clements, whom you might remember from our very first Lockdown episode. They will be joining me as my fellow panellists as we get to be Paul Clark and ask Ken Reid all the questions about his long-standing career. Now, Ken, how has the pandemic affected you in a professional and personal capacity?
Yeah, it's been very difficult. I have leukemia, and it meant that I had to shield. And what I do is largely dealing with people, whether it's Stormont, London, the Dáil, or Brussels, even the United States, and it's face-to-face contact generally. So my whole working environment has changed dramatically, and this room that I'm sitting in now has been on the television a fair bit in the past year because I've had to use Zoom. I found it very restricting, and also, I mean, I retired at the end of March, so I was very much factoring in the fact that somebody, Tracy McGee, would be taking over from me from early April, and I was taking perhaps recently a much more backroom role, although very much still involved with View from Stormont. But it's changed everything. I mean, there was a couple of periods when the regulations relaxed and I actually went up to Stormont a fair bit. But even things like the canteen, it's single tables now, you don't sit with anyone. Everything's changed. I suppose the circumstances of dealing with politicians has changed. It tends to be more using, mobile phone, but also WhatsApp, the other methods that you would all know and take for granted. But the pandemic has changed everything. I think in many ways it has changed politics, and here's the irony. I mean, the executive at Stormont is under considerable pressure. Nothing new there. But in many ways, the one bit of sticking plaster that's still holding it together is actually dealing with the pandemic. And there's many arguments of whether they've done it well or not. But I would suggest if you look at our figures compared to other places, particularly down south, that in fact, and Robin Swan, perhaps, in the health department, take greatest credit for this. We're doing quite well. But even within that, you can see the tensions, the things like the Bobby Story funeral, other episodes where, in fact, things are divided along political lines. But there's no doubt that everybody has found it difficult. Politicians are finding it difficult. You know, Stormont's now, in many ways, it's gone semi-virtual, a hybrid form, a bit like Westminster. The Dáil has moved from the Dáil to the Convention Centre, which is this huge building where, 50, 60 politicians could be in a sort of a maximum at a time. Our politics has been affected, and our institutions have been affected.
I know that probably as a political journalist, you've done a lot of traveling and stuff, to go and cover your stories. Where is the kind of most interesting place you've ever traveled to, or that you learned the most from?
I've been very lucky. In the 1990s, the United States of America became very involved in our process, and Bill Clinton in particular, and it meant that I was over in Washington a lot in the 1990s, and it's a great, I've met I've met Bill Clinton, I met George Bush, Obama, and believe it or not, I met Donald Trump. So, but the most interesting thing was being in the Oval Office when, after the executive was reformed in 2007 and then in 2008, I was in the Oval Office with Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness when they met George Bush. And subsequently, I was in the Oval Office again, and I was very privileged to be a guest at Obama's inauguration in 2009 in Washington. So that was pretty good. I'm a big fan of Westminster because I think Westminster, for all its faults, is a tremendous parliament. And you notice when you move from Stormont to Westminster, the level of debate, there's great orators at Westminster. Stormont's problem was that there was nothing there before Stormont for many years. So you had councillors becoming much more parliamentarians. And in many ways, it didn't work. Now it's improving. And most of our better politicians were at Stormont. There was a dual mandate as well. But certainly in terms of my own experience, the most exciting place has been in the Oval Office in the White House.
The last year under the current pandemic has changed our day-to-day lives and practices immensely. And we're told that the practices that we've picked up will probably continue with us for the next few years. How do you think these changes will affect politics in the future?
What I am particularly interested in, there's elections coming up in Scotland, Wales, and in a lot of the English regions in May, is how they're going to be conducted. Because there'll have to be social distancing when people go in to vote. And I cannot overstate the importance of that Scottish election, particularly in relation to the future of the United Kingdom and indeed the future of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. Because if the SNP does well and obtains a majority, there's considerable doubt about that now. I think that the whole force, the whole push and pressure for a referendum, a second referendum in Scotland, will gain considerable ground, and that has implications for here, because one of the forces that I've noticed more and more, particularly at Westminster over the past, after Brexit, was the rise of English nationalism. And, you know, I got to know Dominic Cummings, sort of a hate figure, fairly well. His argument was, well, there's no votes in Northern Ireland for any of for the Conservative Party, but we need to concentrate in the north of England. And they actually did achieve that with breaking the Red Wall in the December 2019 election. So yeah, I think it will evolve. I'm not quite sure completely how it will go, but there's certainly, in terms of the institutions, I think you could find that there'll be much more virtual input to it. But in terms of the big drama that you would get, say, particularly during the time of Theresa May's time as Prime Minister, I remember one Saturday sitting a couple of years ago where the government was hanging by a thread and absolutely packed, over 550 MPs in the chamber. I'm not sure that can happen in the foreseeable future. So the people around the institutions will have to think how they can overcome that. And one of the ways I do think that they're looking at again, and as a political journalist, I don't like this, but it's electronic voting, because it takes away the excitement. In the Republic of Ireland, they tried it some years ago, and it was seen as an anticlimax, because many people see elections as something of a sport. And we'll see. I think it's going to evolve, but I do think politics and the way politics is run is going to change.
Now, Ken, you mentioned earlier about how the executive has been tackling the COVID-19 pandemic. How do you feel their overall approach has been in general?
I think it's important to remember that the executive was down for 3 years, and they formed it together. It was always going to be fragile, but within 3 months, they were dealing with a global pandemic. And as you can see, governments across the world are struggling with this problem. And so it really was a big take. And Robin Swan, who became the health minister, had been leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. And it just hadn't worked for him. And he had stood down, he said, for family reasons, which is ironic now, since he's probably working nearly 24 hours a day. There's also the problem is this: the attitude of the DUP and the other four parties throughout this has been different. The DUP have much more felt that, you've got to look after business and all of that, where the others were much more inclined to look to Michael McBride and Professor Ian Young for their advice on how to deal with the difficulties. And I think the ironic thing is it's moved on. If you ask me who's the most important person in Northern Ireland at the moment, I would say Dr. Michael McBride. The fact that the executive have held it together, even though we've heard problems and at times Edwin Poots has been pushing a different line to the rest of the executive. But Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill have held it together. And I suppose that they realised when the figures went up, and a lot of over 2,000 people have died here, that they realised that they'd better listen to the medical experts. But of course, the other problem with that is a lot of issues which should have been tackled haven't been, simply because everything has been heading towards the pandemic. But that's not only just in Northern Ireland, that's right across the world.
I was just looking to know, how did you actually get into being the political editor? You know, was there kind of steps that you kind of grew through, or was it just like...
Yeah. After Method, I actually spent 2 years in the civil service before going to university. And I went to Hull University, fairly well known because Philip Larkin, the poet, was the librarian there, amongst others. And it was a very political university. And I got involved with the student magazine and also broadcasting on the student programme on BBC Radio Humberside. I had friends in the Belfast newsletter who were printers, and they managed to get me in as a copy boy in my summer breaks. And there was an editor called John True, and I talked to him and I wrote a few things for him. And all of a sudden I was offered a job. There was a graduate entry scheme in those days, which just don't exist anymore, which is a pity. So I started in the newsletter, and I also covered sport, believe it or not. And then in 1983, I joined as sports editor in the Sunday News, which is the equivalent of the Sunday Life now. And I was sports editor. But in 1985, I was appointed editor there, which was the time of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. You're all too young to remember that, but that was a very traumatic time in this place. It was very contentious. There were hundreds of thousands of people out in the street protesting, all of that. So during that time, I had been looking at new technology. Cork Examiner, believe it or not, was well ahead of the field. And out of the blue, they offered me a job to go down and launch a Sunday paper. I did, but there was an economic recession there at the time, and the Sunday paper didn't materialise. But I love working for them. I covered Europe, I covered Southern politics, all of that. And then in the early 90s, Sky News had a programme from Ireland on a Friday afternoon. And I had an input into that. And somebody in UTV noticed that, and the word got out that I would like to come back. So suddenly I was, first of all, I produced the ceasefire programme for UTV in 1994. And then all of a sudden I was thrown into the job as political correspondent, and then quite quickly, political editor. My degree, by the way, is in politics. I have an interest. And the other thing that helped me a lot was a lot of quite significant politicians that I knew through the National Union of Students when I was at Hull, and then working down in the South for 7 years. It gave me good contacts on both sides, because when we eventually got round to getting a political process going in Northern Ireland, a lot of the work wasn't done here. It was done between the two governments. Never, and then eventually the United States joined it as well. Never underestimate the importance of the relationship between Dublin and London and politics progressing here. And we saw it with the New Decade, New Approach document, where it was Julian Smith and Simon Coveney who were very much at the forefront of that. But yeah, I went in, and I mean, I've been lucky. I've had, as a child, I wanted to be a journalist, probably a political journalist, and I've ended up doing what I wanted to do. So I realise how lucky I've been. And, you know, I've seen the world. I've stood outside some of the nicest buildings in the world reporting on cold and snow. There's not a lot of glamour in it very often, but it's been fascinating having a grandstand seat of what's happening. And really, I suppose the climax of my career was covering Brexit, and the implications of Brexit are probably going to continue for many years to come.
Like you said, you know, you've enjoyed a long and successful career starting from 1977 for the newsletter. Knowing what you know now, if you're back at the beginning of your career, would you do it all over again and become a journalist? And what advice do you have for any aspiring journalists at the beginning of their career?
Yeah, I would. because I love journalism and I think journalism is very important. I don't like some of the trends in it at the moment. I don't like journalists who become the stories about themselves. In many ways, you're a camera on the world. You need to be balanced. There's two sides to every story. And you need to search for the truth and make sure that what you're reporting is absolutely factual. I think it's a great career. I think it's a changing career and something you would know. I mean, we're doing this by Zoom. The digital technology is overtaking everything and television. I mean, I noticed that Fran Unsworth, who is the BBC head of news, said recently that in 10 years she doesn't think there'll be a 6 o'clock news on the BBC, that you'll get it through your iPlayer or some other internet form rather than terrestrial television. I hope that's not the case, but I can see the direction of travel. It's a very changing industry, but I believe in journalism. I believe in good journalism, and I hope that the commercial pressures which are bound to ensue after this pandemic and economic fallout, I think that's a time when journalism is more important than ever to tell people the facts. And I think the other good thing about journalism is diversity. When I became a journalist, it was very much male dominated. And that's very unfair because really, I think that the rise particularly of talented female journalists is one of the most exciting things that has happened. And why not? And there's some wonderful female journalists in Northern Ireland at the moment. You know, Alison Morris, Tracy McGee, Judith Hill, Jane McCormick, Amanda Ferguson. These are trailblazers, and these are the people with good young male reporters as well who can tell you, I hope that I have great faith in them because I think they're all very talented.
Given the state that Northern Ireland is in at the minute, and with the DUP and loyalists being so unhappy with the Northern Ireland Protocol, do you think Northern Ireland will survive another century?
I doubt it. I think I don't think there'll be United Ireland anytime soon, but I do think there are a number of factors in all of this. The demographics are changing, and we have the census this year, and I don't think that the overall figure might be that dramatic, but it could be the first time that the largest minority is not the Protestant community. It could be the Catholic community by 1%. We'll see. But it occurs to me that a border poll is inevitable in the future. You know, it's in the Good Friday Agreement. Now, what would decide that border poll? People who support the DUP are going to vote to remain in the United Kingdom. People who support Sinn Féin are going to vote for a United Ireland. But it occurs to me that it's the middle ground that's going to decide the future of this place. And what I think is significant is in the recent European elections and the Westminster election, we have an assembly election coming, is the rise of the middle ground, people who see themselves as Northern Irish. And the Alliance Party went up to very close to 20%. And I believe that it's those people who are going to decide one way or another whether we remain in the United Kingdom or not. The other factor in all of this is, I suppose from unionism's point of view, they realise that no British Prime Minister wants to be responsible for the breakup of the United Kingdom. But having said that, if Scotland goes its own way, then the rules have changed. And there's also the fact of what sort of United Ireland would it be, because I would imagine for United Ireland, or an agreed Ireland, or whatever you want to call it, there would have to be changes even in terms of a national anthem, flag. So the consequences for people south of the border are as great as for those north. And I'm not sure even an education process has started about that yet. Yeah, but I do think that the constitutional position sometime in the future, I have no idea when, will change.
Thank you.
You've said in a previous interview that overall the future of Northern Ireland is in the hands of the young people. Have you throughout your career seen a change in the relationship between young people and politics? And do you feel that young people are getting their voices heard more by people up in Stormont and the rest of government?
Yes, I do see a significant change. Certainly, when I was first involved in politics, it was dominated by men in grey suits. That's changing. If you look at the chamber at Stormont, you look at the chamber at Westminster, there are more and more young people, and particularly young women, getting involved and realizing that they have a say in things. And I think that young people are the future, and they're going to have to take big decisions on what they want in the future, both constitutionally, every other way, issues, health, education. They can have a say in this, because I actually do believe that the most important thing any of us have is our vote. Democracy is at the center of everything. And it's a case, if you look at, say, the rise in other parties as well, but I'll use Sinn Féin as an example. Sinn Féin was able to grow by appealing to people who were alienated from politics, who normally wouldn't vote. And they managed to tap into that, particularly in the south of Ireland. And you see the subsequent growth. And indeed, Peter Robinson on the DUP side also felt that the growth for his party would be from the business community, which in many ways before that held its nose up with the DUP. But they realised that you've got to grow. And the way to grow is to get people who weren't previously interested, to get them involved in the political system.
So, Alana and Lauren, do you think after listening to Ken speak today, you could perhaps be the next Ken Reid, or would you think of entering the journalism or political sphere in the future?
I really hope so. It's amazing to kind of, speak to Ken today and see that he learned so much, like just throughout his career. You don't go in with all the knowledge, and you learn on the job, and it's, you're constantly learning new things. And that's something that's like really interesting to me. And it's also something that I'd hate to be just stuck in an office all day doing the same thing. So to be speaking to other people from other countries, to be getting their opinions and stuff, just seems like the best job ever. And I'd really hope to be able to do something like that in the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think, having somebody like Ken Reid, especially speaking to you today, it's really inspiring, and it's lovely to sort of see how sort of your past experiences and how you think it's going to change, obviously as young people, how it's going to affect sort of the world we live in the future. And I think through journalism, especially now, I think it's so important that we all engage in it. So I think it's definitely something I would look to in the future.
What would you suggest? Obviously, because opportunities for young people now, especially with COVID, it's very different. So what would you suggest would be the best way to sort of enter that sphere for someone like me or Alana or Lauren now at this time?
Yeah, you actually pester people. The newspapers, the media organizations, and you learn to accept rejection. But all you need is to be lucky once and get something accepted. You need to demonstrate them that you have an interest in something, an expertise in something that their readers or viewers would be interested in. The other thing, at university or college, is get involved with the student TV station, the student newspaper. Get to learn how the business works. That would be my main advice.
Now, as we draw this very interesting conversation to a close, I would like to say a massive thank you on behalf of myself, Alana and Lauren, to Ken for joining us today to speak not only about his career, but what he believes could be the future of Northern Ireland. We've been honoured to be locked down with you today, and this is our last episode of the series, so what a way to finish. Thank you so much to Alana and Lauren for joining me today also. It's been a pleasure as always. So Gur Melgit, and thank you to everyone who joined, and stay safe. Lockdown has been brought to you by Politics in Action.